My name's Doug Ray. I'm in the School of Management, and before that, and still, I was in the Political Science Department. I'm teaching a course now simultaneously on capitalism, which covers much of the same material as I'm going to present this morning. I'm going to give you 4 slideshows, the longest of which has 8 slides. Actually 3 slideshows and 1 data animation. And what we're going to try to do is begin with the widest angle of vision, namely 12,000 years, and look at economic and cultural events, principally in the last 3,000 years, that bear on the subject faith and globalization. Get clear with one another about sequences and periodization. Then we'll look, and that'll take us about 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Then we'll look at something called gapminder.org. How many of you have used Gapminder? What do you think of it, Hillary?
I think it's pretty interesting when we looked at it with your class.
Oh, it was for me. Now, somebody else had their hand up. Stephanie, did you have your hand up?
I did. I looked at it years ago, though. I mean,
It's only been up 2 years.
2 years ago is what it was a new thing, but I liked it and I found it engaging.
Well, it's a terrific way of compressing very complex information and letting you work with it in a very active way. Then we'll finish, actually, with 2 slideshows, one of them about the inheritance of ideas about economics from the classical world and from major world faiths, particularly the Abrahamic faiths. And then finally, we'll look at the question of whether economics, conventional economics, is pertinent to understanding the process of globalization. And we'll give it a mixed review. So those are a lot of things to do in 40 minutes. Let's get started. Let's test this. Okay, there we go. So that's what I just told you. So 12,000 years and 8 slides. This is scaring me. Whole bunch of information got erased. Okay, we're going to do what we can. The beginning of settled agriculture is roughly 10,000 years ago. I know that because other people say it's true. I have no independent confirmation, and I'm not likely to have it. And the founding of the major world faiths is bracketed in the period roughly 1000 BC to 570 AD. And the coming of the global world is much later. The voyages of exploration in the 14 and 1500s. The emergence of the modern nation-state system. Who's in international relations here? All right, Ruta. Are you into sort of state theory and all that stuff or not?
I can give it a
try. Okay. If we start with the Treaty of Westphalia? 1648. Actually, they goofed around with it for 3 or 4 years, so there's several right answers. Let's talk that through a little bit. What war did it end, and what's its alleged significance?
It ended the war in Spain, in the Netherlands.
I think probably you have to shout when you're in the front row. You've got to project to those people.
If I'm not mistaken, it ended 30 years war which was about the Netherlands between Spain and Germany.
and it was effectively the church kind of, it was a decision to secularize, effectively.
Okay? It was to create overarching secular authority, right, in the form of nation states. And there had been things that were a lot like states long before that. Rome, for example, had most of the properties of a state or of a superstate. And certainly the Greek cities, and certainly, say, the Tang dynasty in China. There were state-like things, but there wasn't a system of states. And it turns out that the creation of the Westphalian system of states forms the grid on which globalization has developed. The principal actors in globalization are only partly states. They're often companies and faiths and associations of companies. But the grid, which makes it possible, is the state system. And the properties that states have by definition are two. One is monopoly control of a territory, and it needs to be a well-defined territory, borders, boundaries, colors on a map, and the defining characteristic of a state, as distinct from any other organization, is that it claims the right to a monopoly on the use of force and violence within that territory. So Microsoft can do many terrible things to you. One thing it can't do is take you out in the yard and shoot you. States, in principle, can do that. And states generally, well-functioning states, have very carefully structured apparatus to prevent the excessive use of violence, but it's always there in the background. So if do any of you get parking tickets around here? That's a knowing nod. Angelica, how many you got?
Like 2 or 3.
Oh, just 2 or 3.
Yeah.
You're a piker. How about you, Stephanie?
I will confess
7. Have you paid them?
Yes,
Okay. What if you didn't pay them? What would happen?
they would find me.
They would fine you. Fine you or find you?
Probably both.
Yeah, they would double and then redouble each one, right? And then if you said, screw you,
They lock boot your car.
they would lock boot your car. And then if you decided you were not having that and you went with welding equipment to sever the boot, what would happen then?
Probably arrest.
You would be arrested. And what if you said, I'm not being arrested?
Most likely be forcibly arrested.
Yes, and charged with an additional crime called resisting arrest. And ultimately, if you weren't compliant, you would be put in a jail cell. And that's what we mean, that's the distinctive feature that states have. Even the tiniest little rivulets of authority in a town like New Haven derive from this massive system, which is the grid work of globalization, and which has enormous importance in understanding globalization because all the companies, the kind of companies that Fred has been engaged with and is re-engaging with, rely on the ability to enter into agreements and contracts which are cross-border and which require the functioning of a court system which is unfamiliar. And so there's a world grid of court systems. Then at the nether edge of this, there are what are called failed states, states that don't really work, right? States that don't have an effective monopoly on force and violence. Can anybody name one?
Somalia.
Joel?
Somalia.
Somalia. That's perhaps the most famous. Others?
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone. Others?
Colombia.
Colombia, good. Angola? Well, that's enough. The point is, well, and I'll give you an anecdote. There's a very interesting case where Bechtel Corporation entered into an agreement where they put up a large sum of capital for the right to operate a water system in Bolivia. And they began to charge market rates that people were not prepared to pay, and in fact couldn't pay. It was stupid pricing. But when a mass rebellion emerged, the government of Bolivia just said, sorry guys, we can't help you. We can't protect you or your property. So Bechtel packed its bags, left, and lost the money. And so that's the kind of dependence on state system that I'm trying to sell you. The Western colonial occupation, there's a very bizarre transformation going on between this monitor and this one with the colors. That's what it's orange on this screen. To match, well, it transformed the orange label to green, and so I guess it works. This runs about 1500 to 1960. And for a majority of the world's people, the experience of globalization is rooted in being governed by outside powers, by colonial powers. And the generation of the living is 1 or 2 generations, a grandparent's worth, more or less, south of the moment of independence. This is the commonest story. There are, of course, places where independence came, say, in 1820 with the Southern Cone in South America, for example. But independence is a relatively recent experience, and everything hinges on the readaptation to functioning as independent societies. Now, the white curve is, you got to suspend disbelief here a little bit. This is GDP per capita computed from 10,000 BC to the present. And there's a great scholar, a fellow named Angus Madison, spelled with 2 D's instead of 1. And Angus Madison has done these estimates, and they're very responsible estimates. They're not at all precise, but the gist of it is this, that taking the average, we're not talking about kings and queens and aristocrats, or chiefs and chieftains. We are talking about the general run of people in society, hunter-gatherer societies, agricultural societies, whatever have you. And the long-term story is of fluctuation, local variation, but the mean stays low even in the richest societies. The curve is about, you could think of it as the 90th percentile to the top. It stays low. There are fluctuations. For example, Rome in its good days, a great deal of wealth. Tang China in its high period, quite a lot of wealth. But in general, no widespread affluence which would begin to compare with the advanced capitalist economies today. And the big theorist of this is a guy named Thomas Malthus, who wrote 200 years ago. And Malthus's proposition was really very simple. It was this. Humans multiply geometrically if you give them enough food to do it. So the curve goes. And agricultural production doesn't have that property. As you pour more and more labor into a fixed patch of land to produce food, you get diminishing returns from each added laborer. Right? Does that make intuitive sense? Is there anybody here for whom that doesn't make any sense? Please be frank, because I'm not saying anything deep here. Okay? So, and Malthus's, it's just basically a two-cylinder motor, the model. Geometric progression versus arithmetic progression. And the idea is that there have to be events which prevent overpopulation. And he sees wars and epidemics as such events. And if there is technological progress in a Malthusian world, the effect is not to create widespread affluence, but to create increased population density. So if you get better at growing grains, what that allows you to do is to have a bigger Cairo than you otherwise would have had. Or with Rome, Rome used coercive methods to gather foodstuffs from the whole perimeter of the Mediterranean, and to create in Rome a city of 1 million people with an adequate food supply by pushing down everywhere else. And the single most important event in the economic side of what this course is about is the conclusion of the Malthusian era. And the conclusion of the Malthusian era happens at different times in different places. We are still in the Malthusian era in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in some parts of Latin America, in some parts of Asia. But the majority of the world's people are now leaving the Malthusian era. And people in societies like our own have been beyond Malthus now for well over a century, more like 2 centuries. So there is a transformative set of events that are very important. Now, I didn't prepare slides on demography, but let me just stop and throw this in. It'd be worth your Googling this. Google world demographic transition. And the most important demographic feature of a Malthusian society is high birth rates and high death rates. People have, on average, short lives. And you start with high birth rates, high death rates. And then when the transition starts, it is always triggered by the same thing. And that same thing is basic public hygiene. It is sewers and clean water more than anything else. And when you get sewers and clean water, the death rate falls. Medicine does a little bit for it too. For example, the vaccine for smallpox was important early, and medicine is still important. But even more important than medicine is public hygiene. Allowing people to escape the deadly infections which are caused by contamination through human waste, which were the leading cause of death for thousands of years. And when the death rate falls, an interesting thing happens. The birth rate doesn't budge. This is true everywhere. The first 30 or 50 years after the death rate tilts down, the birth rate stays high. And because the birth rate stays high, what happens? What would be the logically inescapable consequence? Okay, a population surge. So the world's population surges from something like 800 million to something like 6.8 billion. And the surge happens at different times in different places depending on the timing of the demographic transition. But if you want to ask yourself, why is labor so cheap in many parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so expensive almost throughout the northern and Western Europe and North America? The answer is mainly demographic. It's not that we are so much more productive or smarter, though we are more productive because we have more capital. But what we are is scarcer. labor is relatively scarce in the countries which are now 100 or 200 years past the demographic transition. And the countries like Japan, Russia, and Italy, which are way gone past equilibrium, actually have falling populations because their death rates exceed their birth rates, which causes society to age, and you have a profound scarcity of working age population. So that's an aside. Now, inequality is where we're going here. And the bottom of the world economy has stayed pretty flat. That is to say, Malthusian. And as the bottom stays flat and the top goes north, the vertical dimension of the global world becomes overwhelmingly important. And so differences on the order of 10, 20, 50 to 1 in income per capita, mean income per capita between countries, and also in between regions within large countries, becomes a principal fact of globalization. I have a piece of fiction to recommend to those who would like to explore how that looks at ground level. The fiction is called White Tiger. It won the Man Booker Prize a year ago, and it's India seen from the point of view of a highly intelligent, morally flawed, in his own terms, half-baked person struggling to make a living in a marketized economy where he is one of about 700 million people who just don't cut it in the way of skills, of advanced education and the basis of skills that allow you to be something other than, for example, a chauffeur. It's a terrific book. It's on par with Dickens or Zola in their writings about Europe a century ago. So the consequence of that is that the ratio of top to bottom gets to be immensely, it gets to be staggering. So that the cost, whose is this? Is it yours?
Yes.
Hope, what did it cost?
I think at the school refectory anyway, it was $1.50, $2.
$1.50, $2. There are a billion people out there for whom that is a day's income. All right, so that's just a huge fact about globalization. Last slide of this group. In each one of these societies, you have an income curve that looks like this. Subsistence on the left, being as wealthy as Miroslav on the right. And the curve always looks about the same. The mean varies, the skewness varies, but the gist of the curve is always the same. And the American curve looks a lot like this. I could show, I've got a slide of it. So you've got a mass of people near the bottom and an elite minority toward the top. And here's a proposition. The minority toward the top has, without exception, disproportionate influence on the conduct of states. There are no exceptions to that. Not even Cuba. Cuba has a tiny elite which has access to hard currencies that no one else in Cuba has access to, and the government is its personal property, or pretty nearly so. This curve is nothing global about this curve. It's just the way it is in each particular society. Now, hide keynote. Now, this fellow Hans Rosling, damn it. Hans Rosling is a Swedish economist kind of a lefty. And he's created a data animation, which is called Gapminder, gapminder.org. And you can change the dimensions, but I have it set up here so that income per person in logarithmic scale, right? So it makes it easier to read by putting it in logarithmic scale. Income per person, $200 a year here, $40,000 here, and Miro's rate out here. And life expectancy here. And I've set it to the year 1831. And if you poke around and ask who are the outliers here, you get the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Germany, France, the Scandinavian countries. They were toward the end of the demographic transition at this time, and were high side outliers in both dimensions. Now let's play 170 years of economic history in 12 seconds. The bubbles are proportional to the population of a country. The big red one is China, the big blue one is India, the middle-sized yellow one is the USA. I'm going to ask you to give me a 3-sentence summary of what you're seeing. It'll be a cold call, so think. Okay. Nathaniel. You say Nathaniel or Nate?
Nathaniel, yeah.
Okay, Nathaniel. What'd you see?
Well, a radical increase in the disparities.
Okay, a radical increase in the disparities. Okay, that's an interesting point. A huge increase in disparities. And let's see, people I haven't talked to. Catherine, what else?
I also noticed just that looking at the disparities country by country, for example, it's much of all of sub-Saharan Africa is lagging behind as the U.S., for example, and China in some ways.
Okay, lagging behind at a recently increasing rate,
Yeah, I noticed that.
right? It was with the pack for a while and then not with the pack. It's a really interesting fact. And maybe it's too banal, but what's the biggest generalization you might make about this? How do you say genia? Genia. Genia-ry, sorry.
That's all right.
We got it all now.
The countries that were ahead to begin with, the majority stayed ahead, and those that seem to be behind, the exception, China, stayed behind.
Okay, there are actually 4 exceptions, and they're called the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Those are the surging large systems that have surged at disproportionate rates in the last generation. And if you wanted to put the best face on all this, you could say something nice. What could you say that's nice? Alan.
It almost all went up everywhere, or it went up almost everywhere.
Okay, most of the world is drifting from lower left toward upper right. Right? Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes steadily, sometimes erratically. But let's look at it again and look for that last point. Actually started it even earlier. Notice this. That was Mao. So you've got what makes globalization irresistible is that, right? It is a general increase in the standard of living, very unevenly shared, but invariably shared in. You remember the income curve with the tail out on the right? In every single country, the decision makers are in the tail out on the right. So a policy that resists the forces that are pushing things from lower left toward upper right is not likely to be embraced by those groups. Okay. Questions on this? We've got, I want to save 10 minutes for the other. Questions? Okay, let's go back to the slides. Now we're going to talk a little about religion, and I speak with great trepidation. My father was a Protestant clergyman, but I am a secular humanist more than anything else. And Miroslav, please correct me if I stray out of bounds here.
Go for it, buddy.
This is saying, oh, did you guys read anything yet or not?
Yeah.
So you read the Jerry Muller. Okay, mostly what I'm doing here is Jerry Muller. Okay, and I won't attempt to pronounce the Latin, but the proposition from St. Augustine, if one does not lose, the other cannot gain, is a profoundly pessimistic assumption about the way economic life works. And it was widely shared by the classics, by the Greeks and Romans, less by the Romans than the Greeks, but widely shared. And the Abrahamic religions, I think, by and large, inherited that belief. Here's Muller's summary of about the Christians. The fathers of the church adhered to the classical assumption that since the material wealth of humanity was more or less fixed, the gain of some could come only at a loss to others. Did many of you grow up kind of thinking that? The notion of mutual gain through exchange is so deeply embedded in our, to refer back to Miroslav's discussion, our pleasure-seeking, what was the full phrase? Managed pleasure-seeking. In a society founded on managed pleasure-seeking, and the economists would just substitute utility for pleasure, utility-seeking. The notion that gains from trade are possible is wired into everyone, I think. Anybody not kind of, okay. So this is how much I get, and that's how much you get. And movements along the budget line, good for you, bad for me, good for me, bad for you. And this is a common assumption. It is foundational to Marxism, incidentally. One of the tricks in Marxism is that the labor theory of value is a way of reincarnating this assumption. So that from a Marxist point of view, if I increase our productivity and give you a higher wage, if I'm the capitalist, it's a trick. I'm expropriating hours of your labor because we're on a plane like this one. Now, the foundational notion of market societies is you can move the budget plane out. You can increase the total to be shared. And you can do that, for example, by loaning money at interest, by practicing usury. And if there is a market which pushes money at interest toward its highest and best uses, you can push the plane faster than if you don't do that. I believe that to be true. Now, the corollaries of this that have importance to the faith side of globalization are these, I'm really just summarizing Muller here. The prohibition on usury was shared in the Abrahamic religions. The Jews had the variant that allowed loans at interest to non-Jews. And that difference actually becomes consequential in European anti-Semitism. There's a just price theory that is implicit in all of this. Muller doesn't make this explicit, but it's there. The notion that there is a correct price for a can of Coke Zero or a Mont Blanc pen. And if I manage to palm it off on you for more than that price, I'm committing an ethical violation. Or if you contrive to get it from me for less than that price, you're committing an ethical violation. And that, if you think about it, that jibes with the zero-sum assumption that we discussed a minute ago. Labor theory of value is in Marx and actually in Smith and Ricardo. The labor theory of value is the main, labor content is the main determinant of the just price. And again, that's, it's not unfair, I think, to say that that's wrong. But it's right, you can say it's right in a normative way if you want, but as a description of how markets work, it's almost invariably wrong. Because the capital component, including intellectual capital, is just enormously important. The dynamics of European anti-Semitism. Did you pick this up on pages 10 and 11 of Muller? Anybody recite the gist of how that went? Come on. Go for it, Stephanie.
Well, he suggested that because it was prohibited usury in the biblical passages, that most Christians then went to the Jews in order to do lending and the increase of interest.
Okay, perfect. And at the same time, they expropriated land. They forbade Jews to own land. So Jews became relatively specialized in banking-related functions. There were some other functions. And when the economies went sour, blaming the Jews became a dominant response. And that's a pretty important historical event. Okay, last leg. And now we're going to talk about Schumpeter. Did you read Schumpeter? He's not a gifted writer. He's a downright bad writer. But he is, I believe Joseph Schumpeter was the best economist ever except for Adam Smith. And his story is interesting. He's Austrian, was a real banker, a real businessman, a real government minister, taught in a provincial university in Austria. While teaching, his first year of teaching as a junior faculty member, the library forbade the distribution of certain materials to his seminar students. And he challenged the university librarian to a duel, which he won. And I won't editorialize on that, but it's a good thing he didn't lose, because he really was a great economist. He then went to Harvard, and Yale every year made him an offer. His summer house was near Yale. He's in fact buried right here. But he said no every year. What a fool. And Schumpeter, what Schumpeter gets is this. This is a neoclassical equilibrium theory about supply and demand, and the idea is that markets always are moving toward this point of equilibrium, where the curves intersect and you get a stable price outcome. And what Schumpeter believed, and what Marx believed, is that that is an ephemeral and evanescent feature of the way markets really work. And the way markets really work is that there is always novelty which is disruptive. Always novelty which pushes out of equilibrium. Let me tell you, let's tell, this is a true story. Tennis rackets. For 100 years or more, tennis rackets were all made about the same way out of wood, laminated wood. And there was great competition within it among 3 or 4 world producers. And then what happened? Who's a tennis player? Surely we don't have 25 people without a tennis player. You're a tennis player. Okay, what's your racket made of? Aluminum. Okay, and could you find a wooden racket?
In a museum.
In a museum. The only place I've ever been in the last 20 years where you could buy one in a retail store was Cuba. They are still making and selling wooden rackets. That's what Schumpeter has in mind by creative destruction. Somebody finds a new way to make an old product or a way to make a new product which completely blows away the price competition that was going on in that industry. And over again, you get violent disruptions of equilibrium. This is the Santa Fe Institute. Santa Fe Institute did the following thing 10 years ago. They got 6 of the top 10 or so physicists in the world and 6 of the top economists in the world and made them spend a week together talking about their theories. And where'd my books go? Here we go. And then at the end, the guy who was the spokesman among the physicists said, when the economists had laid out all their assumptions, said, "You guys really believe that?" With stuff like perfect information, high degree of rational calculation, all that. And the economist, backed into a corner, replied, "Yeah, but this allows us to solve those problems. If you don't make these assumptions, then you can't do anything." And the physicist came right back, "Yeah, but where does that get you? You're solving the wrong problems if it's not reality." Okay, and what's really interesting is most of the equations in conventional neoclassical economics, where do they come from? Elementary textbooks in physics. They are the same equations as used in Newtonian physics because they are equilibrium theories and they make sense only where Schumpeter and Marx are wrong. And all I want to say to you is that Schumpeter and Marx are more often than not right about the way the global economy functions. Marx, and it was this, that's not the picture you usually see of Marx. This is the Marx who got that. This is young Marx. And young Marx completely got that. He hadn't gotten all caught up in that unbelievably convoluted theory of his. He really got this point. And if you read the first 10 or 20 pages of the Communist Manifesto, it reads like an accurate description of the way the economy works. When he begins to make prognoses and deterministic theories, he goes astray. But as young Marx really nailed it. And there's Schumpeter. Schumpeter, in addition, was quite a womanizer. He used to say, "It is my ambition to become the greatest horseman, the greatest economist, and the greatest lover in the Western world. I have so far succeeded on only 2 counts." And he left it for you and me to decide. He actually had a 50-year marriage, so. And Schumpeter had this notion. This is a way of schematizing it into waves of innovation, where you get to a kind of equilibrium under a given dominant technology, and then a new technology comes along and smacks it. Okay, Miroslav, can you get us from here to what we'll be doing at our next meeting?